"This is Sparta." That iconic line from the 2006 film 300 became a cultural phenomenon. The movie presented Sparta as the ultimate defenders of freedom and Western civilization, making a heroic stand against the tyrannical Persian Empire at the Battle of Thermopylae. 300 brave warriors choosing death over submission, fighting for liberty against despotism. It's a powerful story, it's visually stunning, and it's almost completely backwards. The historical Sparta wasn't a beacon of freedom. It was one of the most oppressive, militaristic societies in human history. While the film portrays Spartans fighting for liberty, the real Sparta was built on the systematic enslavement and terror of an entire population. While the movie shows Persians as tyrannical invaders, Persia actually had more political freedom and social mobility than Sparta did. 300 isn't just historically inaccurate, it inverts the actual values of the societies it depicts. The result is a film that makes Sparta heroic by ignoring almost everything that made historical Sparta what it actually was. Today we're breaking down what 300 got wrong about Sparta, what Spartan society was really like, and why the true story is far more disturbing than the film suggests. This isn't about ruining an entertaining movie, it's about understanding the vast gulf between Hollywood's Sparta and the historical reality. Let's get into it. The single most important fact about Sparta that 300 completely ignores. Spartan society was built on the systematic enslavement of the Helot population. The Helots were the conquered indigenous people of Laconia and Messenia, the regions Sparta controlled. They outnumbered Spartan citizens by perhaps 7 or 8 to 1. They worked the land, produced the food, and did all the labor that allowed Spartan citizens to spend their lives training for war. But they weren't just agricultural workers or servants. They were slaves in the most complete sense, property owned by the Spartan state, with no rights, no freedom, and subjected to systematic terror to keep them submissive. Every year, Sparta formally declared war on the Helots. This wasn't a metaphor. It was an official state action that made killing Helots legal and even encouraged. Young Spartan men, as part of their training, would be sent out on a practice called the Cryptia, essentially a terror campaign, where they would hunt and kill Helots, particularly those who showed leadership qualities or signs of resistance. Think about that. The society 300 presents as freedom fighters had an official program where their young men would murder slaves to keep the population terrorized and submissive. This wasn't a secret or something Spartans were ashamed of. It was an integral part of their system, described by ancient historians like Plutarch. The Helots lived under constant threat. They were forced to wear distinctive clothing, marking their status. They were beaten and humiliated publicly to remind them of their place. Ancient sources describe Helots being forced to get drunk and perform humiliating acts, so Spartan youth could see the degradation of slavery and appreciate their own status. This wasn't incidental to Sparta. It was fundamental. The entire Spartan military system, their famous training, their warrior culture, all of it was only possible because enslaved Helots did all the actual work. Spartan citizens could spend their lives training for war because they had an enslaved population feeding them and serving them. When you watch 300 and see Spartans fighting for freedom, remember, they were fighting to preserve a system where the vast majority of people in their territory had no freedom whatsoever. They weren't defending liberty. They were defending their right to enslave and terrorize the Helots. The film never mentions Helots, not once. This is like making a film about the antebellum American South and never mentioning slavery. It's not just an omission, it's a fundamental distortion that completely changes our understanding of the society being depicted. Even for Spartan citizens, the warrior elite depicted in 300 life was rigidly controlled in ways that make the film's celebration of freedom deeply ironic. From age 7, Spartan boys were taken from their families and placed in the agoge, the brutal state training system. For the next 13 years, they lived in barracks, underwent harsh physical training, were deliberately underfed to encourage theft. Getting caught was punished, but stealing itself was praised as showing initiative, and were subjected to systematic violence and hardship designed to make them tough warriors. This wasn't optional education. This was mandatory state indoctrination. Every male Spartan citizen went through this. Those who didn't complete it successfully couldn't become full citizens. The state controlled every aspect of upbringing, designed to produce obedient soldiers who valued the collective over individual desires. Even after completing the agoge, Spartan men lived in military barracks until age 30, eating communal meals and training constantly. They couldn't live with their wives. They couldn't engage in trade or crafts. Such activities were considered corrupting and were forbidden. A Spartan citizen was a soldier, period. Everything else was stripped away. The famous Spartan discipline wasn't about personal virtue or individual choice. It was about state control. Spartans were forbidden from traveling abroad without permission because exposure to other societies might corrupt them. They were forbidden from accumulating wealth. They ate the same black broth, wore similar clothing, and lived regimented lives because the state demanded uniformity and obedience. Spartan women had somewhat more freedom than women in other Greek city-states, which is often cited as evidence of Spartan progressiveness. But this wasn't because Sparta valued women's rights. It was because Spartan men were constantly away training or fighting, so women had to manage estates. Even this relative freedom existed within the framework of a militaristic society focused entirely on producing warriors. The Spartan government was a mixed constitution, with 2 kings, a council of elders, and an assembly, but real power lay with a small group of elite overseers called ephors, who could veto decisions and maintained ideological control. Political dissent was not tolerated. Innovation was discouraged. The entire system was designed to preserve the status quo and maintain military readiness. This was totalitarianism in ancient form. The state controlled education, economic activity, where citizens could live, what they could do for a living, and even enforced eugenic policies, reportedly examining newborns and exposing those deemed unfit. Individual freedom, as we understand it, barely existed. Yet 300 present Spartans as freedom fighters, making speeches about liberty. King Leonidas talks about free men versus slaves. The irony is almost painful when you understand what Sparta actually was. 300 presents the Persian Empire as a tyrannical, oppressive force bent on destroying freedom. But the historical Persian Empire was actually far more tolerant, diverse, and administratively sophisticated than the film suggests. The Achaemenid Persian Empire was the largest empire the world had yet seen, stretching from Egypt to India. Governing such a vast, diverse territory required administrative skill and relative tolerance. The Persians developed a system that, by ancient standards, was remarkably progressive. First, religious tolerance. The Persian Empire included dozens of different peoples with different religions, and Persian policy was generally to allow local religious practices to continue. The famous Cyrus Cylinder, created by Cyrus the Great, includes what might be the first declaration of human rights, proclaiming that conquered peoples should be allowed to worship their own gods. When Persians conquered Babylon, they freed the Jews who had been held there and allowed them to return to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple. Compare this to Sparta, where the state religion was enforced, foreigners were viewed with suspicion, and the entire society was closed and xenophobic. Second, administrative sophistication. The Persian Empire was divided into provinces called satrapies, each governed by a satrap who had considerable autonomy. The empire built an extensive road network, established a courier system that could move messages across the empire quickly, and created a standardized currency. This was complex governance on a scale Sparta never attempted or achieved. Third, social mobility. While the Persian Empire certainly had inequality and was ruled by an aristocratic class, there are examples of people from conquered territories rising to positions of power and influence. Talented administrators, soldiers, and officials could advance regardless of their ethnic origin. Sparta, by contrast, had rigid social stratification where citizenship was hereditary and closely guarded. Fourth, treatment of conquered peoples. Persian policy was generally to leave local power structures in place as long as tribute was paid and loyalty maintained. They didn't impose Persian culture or language on conquered peoples. Again, compare this to Sparta's treatment of conquered helots, enslavement and systematic terror. Now, none of this means the Persian Empire was a democracy or a utopia by modern standards. It was an absolute monarchy. The king's word was law. There were certainly acts of violence and oppression. Rebellions were crushed. But by the standards of ancient empires, Persian rule was relatively benign, and in many ways more free than life in Sparta. The film's portrayal of Persians as decadent, effeminate, and tyrannical relies on Orientalist stereotypes. The grotesque depiction of Xerxes as a towering, pierced, androgynous figure in golden chains is pure fantasy, designed to make him seem alien and threatening. The real Xerxes was a capable ruler of a sophisticated empire. The irony is thick. The film presents Sparta as defending freedom against Persian tyranny, when the reality was almost the opposite. Persia was a vast, relatively tolerant empire. Sparta was a small, closed, oppressive society built on slavery and systematic violence. Let's talk about the actual Battle of Thermopylae, because while 300 gets some tactical details right, it distorts the strategic and political context significantly. First, the numbers. The film focuses on 300 Spartans, which is accurate for the number of Spartan citizens who fought. But they weren't alone. The total Greek force at Thermopylae was around 7,000 men from various Greek city-states. There were Thespians, Thebans, Phocians, and contingents from other cities. All of these men fought, and many died alongside the Spartans. The film erases these allies to create a more dramatic narrative about 300 men standing alone. But this distorts history. Thermopylae was a Greek effort, not just a Spartan one. When Leonidas made his famous last stand, 700 Thespians stayed with him and died. They deserve recognition too. Second, the strategic context. The film portrays Leonidas as defying the Spartan government to go fight for freedom. In reality, Thermopylae was part of a coordinated Greek defensive strategy. There was simultaneous naval action at Artemisium. The idea was to hold the Persians at narrow points, Thermopylae on land, Artemisium at sea, where Greek advantages in heavy infantry and naval tactics could offset Persian numbers. Leonidas didn't go rogue. He was sent as part of an official Spartan force. The reason he only took 300 Spartans initially was because of a religious festival, the Carnaia, that restricted military activity. The plan was for more Spartans to follow after the festival ended. They never got the chance. Third, why Sparta fought. The film presents Spartans fighting for freedom and civilization. In reality, Sparta fought because a Persian conquest of Greece would have ended Spartan power. This was self-defense and preservation of their system, not some idealistic defense of liberty. It's also worth noting that after the Persian Wars ended, Sparta didn't become a beacon of freedom. They became increasingly authoritarian and imperialistic. Within decades, Sparta was fighting Athens in the Peloponnesian War, and when Sparta won, they installed tyrannical governments in defeated cities. So much for defending freedom. Fourth, the aftermath. The film ends with Leonidas' death and a brief coda about Greek victory. But it doesn't mention that after Thermopylae, the Persians proceeded through Greece, captured Athens, and burned the Acropolis. The Greeks eventually won at Salamis and Plataea, but those victories involved multiple city-states and complex strategies. Thermopylae was a delaying action, not the decisive battle. The real story of Thermopylae is interesting. A small force using terrain and tactics to hold off a much larger army, buying time for Greek defenses to organize. That's impressive military history. But it's not the simplified morality tale 300 presents. Sparta has been mythologized throughout history, and 300 is just the latest iteration of a very old tradition of viewing Sparta as an ideal warrior society. Understanding why this myth persists helps explain the film. The idealization of Sparta began even in ancient times. Some Greek philosophers, particularly those skeptical of democracy, admired Sparta's stability and discipline. Plato praised aspects of Spartan education. Later Roman writers, looking back at Sparta, admired their military prowess and self-sacrifice. But ancient sources also criticized Sparta heavily. Athenian writers viewed Sparta as backwards, oppressive, and culturally sterile. Sparta produced almost no literature, art, or philosophy, while Athens was generating drama, philosophy, and art that would influence Western civilization for millennia. Sparta was producing soldiers. That's it. The modern romanticization of Sparta intensified in the 19th and 20th centuries. European military thinkers admired Spartan discipline. The ideal of the warrior citizen who sacrifices for the state appealed to various political movements, including some very dark ones. Fascist Italy and certain elements in other authoritarian regimes explicitly drew on Spartan imagery and ideology. 300 draws on this tradition of Spartan idealization. The film is based on Frank Miller's graphic novel, which was inspired by a 1962 film, The 300 Spartans, which itself was Cold War propaganda presenting Spartans as defenders of Western freedom against Eastern tyranny. Each iteration simplified and mythologized Sparta further. The problem is that this myth obscures what Sparta actually was, a society so militarized and repressive that even other ancient Greeks found it extreme, a society that produced great warriors but almost nothing else of value. A society that ultimately failed. Sparta declined and was eventually conquered, its system proving unsustainable. The Spartan military machine was effective for a time, but it was built on foundations of slavery and oppression that made it brittle. When Sparta lost key battles and the Helot population finally rebelled successfully, the entire system collapsed. You can't build a lasting civilization solely on military prowess and the enslavement of others. Yet the myth persists. 300 is just the most recent and visually spectacular version of a long tradition of romanticizing Sparta while ignoring its profound darkness. To be fair to 300, let's acknowledge what it does well and why it succeeds as entertainment, even as we critique its history. Visual style. The film's stylized visual approach is distinctive and memorable. The heightened colors, the slow-motion action, the graphic novel aesthetic. It's visually striking and creates a mythic atmosphere. This is intentional and effective filmmaking. Action sequences. The fight choreography captures something of the phalanx fighting style. The emphasis on shields, spears, and coordinated movement reflects actual hoplite warfare tactics, even if dramatically enhanced. Leonidas as character, Gerard Butler's performance makes Leonidas compelling. He's charismatic, determined, and complex within the film's framework. As a character study of a warrior king, it works. The source material. The film is faithful to Frank Miller's graphic novel, which was never intended as documentary history. It's a stylized, mythic retelling. Judging it purely as history is somewhat unfair. It's adapting a comic book, not a history text. Emotional impact. The film effectively communicates themes of sacrifice, courage, and resistance against overwhelming odds. These are powerful human themes that resonate across cultures. So why is this still problematic? Because most viewers don't know the history. They don't realize how much is fiction or distortion. 300 becomes, for many people, their primary understanding of Sparta and the Persian Wars. When the film presents Spartans as freedom fighters and Persians as tyrannical invaders, audiences believe that's historically accurate. And the complete erasure of slavery from Sparta isn't a neutral creative choice. It fundamentally changes what Sparta was. You can't understand Sparta without understanding that it was built on enslaving and terrorizing the majority of its population. Removing that makes Sparta something it wasn't. It's just a movie is a common defense. And yes, 300 is entertainment, not a documentary. But historical fiction still shapes how people understand the past, and that has consequences. First, it affects education. Teachers trying to teach actual history about Sparta face students who know from 300 that Spartans were freedom fighters. Correcting those misconceptions takes time and effort. False beliefs are sticky. Once planted, they're hard to uproot. Second, it influences political discourse. The rhetoric of 300 defending freedom, standing against tyranny, the clash of civilizations, has been used in modern political debates. When people invoke Thermopylae in contemporary contexts, they're usually drawing on 300's version, not historical reality. Third, it romanticizes militarism and authoritarianism. Sparta is held up as an ideal when in reality it was a cautionary tale, a society so focused on military power that it produced nothing else and ultimately failed. There are lessons in Sparta's history, but they're not the ones 300 teaches. Finally, the real history is more interesting and more useful. Understanding what Sparta actually was, the tensions in its society, the unsustainability of a system built on slavery, the gap between military prowess and cultural achievement offers genuine insights. Hollywood's Sparta teaches us nothing because it's fiction. This doesn't mean we can't enjoy 300 as entertainment, but we should enjoy it while understanding its fantasy, not history. And we should use it as an opportunity to learn what really happened, which is far more complex and interesting than the film suggests. 300 presents Sparta as humanity's last stand for the freedom against tyrannical Persia. The reality was nearly opposite. Sparta was an oppressive, slave-based society, while Persia was relatively tolerant and sophisticated. The Spartans at Thermopylae fought bravely, but they weren't fighting for freedom. They were fighting to preserve their power and their system of enslaving and terrorizing the Helots. This doesn't diminish the courage of the men who fought at Thermopylae. Military valor can exist in service to bad causes, but we shouldn't mistake tactical bravery for moral virtue, or confuse military skill with the love of liberty. The real Sparta offers lessons about the dangers of militarism taken to extremes, the unsustainability of societies built on oppression, and the difference between being good at war and being good. 300 offers none of these lessons because it presents a sanitized fantasy. Sparta that never existed. Enjoy the movie, a spectacle if you like, but remember, this is Sparta. And historical Sparta was nothing like what the film depicts. If you enjoyed this historical deep dive, let me know in the comments what other historical myths you'd like me to tackle. And if this changed how you view 300 or Sparta, consider subscribing. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.